All right, so we are at Free Code Camp OKC. I'm Kimberly Collins. I'm one of the co-organizers of the group. Today we're talking about C#, just giving a very basic intro because several people in the group have mentioned that they would like to learn a little bit about that to improve their, job marketability. If you want to check out my GitHub, it's there. It's just as much under construction as anybody else's, but there's a link if you're interested. We're here at Starspace, which is an awesome co-working facility that also has this area where we can have events. They have user groups and other events going on all the time, so check their calendar on their website. And they also have a meetup group with other events going on. So I definitely recommend, if you're not on Meetup, and checking out other groups to do that. Also, Techlahoma has about 30 groups around the state. Ours is one of them on the list if you go to meetup.com/pro/Techlahoma. That was weird. Thanks, Ava. Yes, and we talked about my Meetup app a little bit, that it's like half done, but it's there to aggregate all the groups if you want to check those out. If you're not in our Slack, I would definitely recommend doing that. This is the link where you can sign up, and we have a channel just for Free Code Camp. And if you want to message me, ask me any questions, you can do that in a private message. My username is Kimberly Collins. Hopefully that's easy to find. You can find videos, thanks to Ava, on Twitch, and then those get broadcast to YouTube later when she has the time to do that. So if you want to check out previous meetups from our group or also other groups, I would definitely recommend that. Next week, I just wanted to let y'all know that it's a holiday weekend. We meet every Sunday except for things like holidays. It's Father's Day, so we won't be meeting here. And then also for the 4th of July weekend, we won't be meeting. And then between those, we're going to have the campfire talks that we have at the end of every month. If you haven't done one of those yet, let me know if you want to do just a very informal, it doesn't even have to be super technical talk. And again, you can see previous ones on Twitch and YouTube to get an idea of what people talk about. That's already on Meetup. I think we have 3 speakers now, and we could probably use a 4th one. So if you haven't done a talk before, this is the perfect opportunity in an informal environment. It doesn't have to be streamed if you don't want it to be, to do your first somewhat technical talk. But today we're talking about C#, and the reason I'm talking about it is that I've been using it for over 10 years. So I have a good amount of experience with it, but then it was hard for me to bring it down to beginner level. I tried as much as I could to focus just on C#, just on the basics you would need if you've never even seen it before. And a lot of people ask me how I got started with C#. After I graduated from OU with my physics degree, I decided I wanted to do programming, so I went to OCCC and got a 2-year degree in programming, and one of the courses was C#. So when people ask me, how'd you get started, that's how I got started, and that was in 2005, which we were just talking about how that can't possibly be 12 years ago, but it was. So another question I get a lot is, why should I even learn C#? I'm a JavaScript developer. I'm planning to get a job doing JavaScript. What's the point of even learning another language? But I would ask you, what's the point of learning a new spoken language? Like, why would I want to learn Spanish or German or French? And I think it's obvious what some of those reasons are, and I see those exact same reasons in learning a new programming language. So even if it's not a programming language you're even ever planning to use, learning some of the fundamentals and basics of another language gives you an idea of what the differences and the similarities are. Just like a spoken language, you get introduced to a new culture even, because JavaScript developers and C# developers definitely see things differently, and it'd be good to see things from a C# developer's point of view. And so I think you can even think of more reasons why it'd be good to learn a natural spoken language. And I've been teaching English as a second language for 15 years, and so I definitely see what my students go through to learn a new spoken language. We go through those same things learning a new programming language. So I hope I've convinced you that learning any new programming language is a good idea, but specifically C#, the reason we're going through it, even though it's not part of Free Code Camp, it's a major factor here in the Oklahoma City job market. So I would say that C# is an excellent language to learn. I'm assuming that most of y'all know at least some JavaScript, but not so much C#. So I'm coming at this talk from a JavaScript background, even though I came to JavaScript after C#. So I did this backwards from the rest of y'all, but hopefully I can explain how to get started with C#. Some of the major features of the language: first, it's an object-oriented language, and you can do object-oriented programming in JavaScript, but it's at a much deeper level, I would say, in C#. So I think that learning object-oriented programming in C# will help you become a better JavaScript developer, because you'll almost be forced to learn this object-oriented method of programming. A difference between JavaScript and C# is that C# is compiled and JavaScript isn't. So there's a layer that happens between when you're writing the C# code and what the computer runs, and that's the compilation. And so I think that is a little tricky for JavaScript developers to get used to, that it takes a little bit of time to build your code. You might not be used to this idea of something happening to your code before it's runnable. And the third, I think the hardest to get used to, is that types are static in C#, where in JavaScript they are dynamic. And just to go over a little bit of what that looks like in JavaScript, this is JavaScript code that I'm showing you. I can create a variable and assign it a string value, and then I can assign it an integer value, and that's no problem at all to do, because the type belongs to the value itself. So the string Kimberly is a string. It has the type of string. The integer 36, like the type is a property of the value itself, and then the variable, I call it dynamic here, is just a label for the value, but it's the value that has the type, and you can put that same variable label on any value, and JavaScript doesn't care. Yes? Okay, so yeah, this is JavaScript code. So in JavaScript, types are dynamic. This is C# code, where the types are static. And it does know that, in my example here, Kimberly is a string. I've got my quotes around it. It knows this is a string. And also, when I'm creating my name variable, I'm assigning it the type of string. So I can't later say name equals 36. That wouldn't be allowed in C#, where it is allowed in JavaScript. That's a major difference between the two languages. So here, as opposed to JavaScript, where the type belongs to the value, in C#, the type belongs to the variable itself. And whenever you assign a value to that variable, it has to have that same type. So you asked, how does it know that it's a string? Using type inference, which exists in C# and in JavaScript, you actually don't have to use the word string. It knows that my string Kimberly is a string. So I can use var name, and that totally works fine. Var is a little bit different in C# than it is in JavaScript. It's not dynamic like it is in JavaScript. It's just a shortcut for you, because these two lines of code are exactly the same to the compiler. It doesn't care. When you hover over in your IDE the word name, it says it's a string, so you don't have the choice later of changing name to 36.
So what if I do something divide Kimberly by 2?
That would not be allowed. I need to remember to repeat the questions here. So can you divide Kimberly by 2? No. I'm not. I'm not sure what it does in JavaScript, but in C#, you're definitely. I think that JavaScript developers feel kind of confined by this or constrained, and they see that as a bad thing. But I see it as a really good thing. When you're working with a group of people, you're not just working with your code. People are working with your code and vice versa. And so being able to make assumptions about the variable is a really good thing. So don't see it as a constraint on your code. See it as something that helps you. Because you want the type checking and the type problems to happen at compile time, not at runtime. You want to be able to fix it before users even see your code or see your use your code. So I think that's a major difference between C# and JavaScript. Is this static typing. JavaScript has a few built-in types, and C# has several more. There's the int, and then several other integer types that you probably don't ever have to worry about. As far as numbers, there are also decimals, doubles, floats. We have a bool, the boolean. In addition to string, we also have a char, which is just one letter or one number, one character. And then we have the object type. But then there's an infinite number of customizable types. You can use the standard .NET library that comes with all sorts of custom types, and you can create your own. I listed 4 possibilities. We'll go over classes and enum. Structs and interfaces are a little bit more advanced. I don't use structs. I don't know how they're actually used in the real world, but you can create custom types in C#. So some of the minor differences between C# and JavaScript, in C#, on your strings, you need to use double quotes. You can't use single quotes like in JavaScript. A single quote is for a single character. So in JavaScript, you can choose whether you want single or double quotes, but in C#, it makes a difference whether it's string or character. Another difference is the semicolons are optional in JavaScript, but in C# they are required. There is no such thing as a triple equals for comparison. You'll always just use double equals in C#. So there are several different types of applications that you can create, and Daniel went over a few of those last week. We're going to be talking about console applications today. There's also all sorts of desktop applications and web applications that you can create using C#, but I want to focus on console apps today. That's when you just have a text-only interface. There is no UI. There's not really a screen per se. There aren't buttons that the user is interacting with, and I think that's really good for getting started because you can focus just on the C# and not also have to deal with all these other things for the user interface. And that's not to say these aren't used in the real world. The times I've used them are either when I'm creating an app that I'm going to use personally myself and it's not really for anyone else, it's a utility, or if it's for my team to use. I don't need to make a pretty user interface for my team. You can have text input and that's fine. Another time that it's used is when your processes are going to be automated. You want a process to run nightly or hourly. The computer doesn't need a screen, so we're just going to have this text-only interface for the console applications. You have a main method. In JavaScript, we call them functions. In C#, we call them methods. And that's where the execution starts, is in the main method of your console application. The main thing you're going to be doing is writing to and reading from the console. And this will be familiar to you if you use console logging in JavaScript. We're doing console.writeLine to print text out, usually some sort of instructions to the user. And then we're reading the lines back in of what the user inputs, and then doing some logic in between. So we're we're writing instructions, reading in the user's input, doing something with it, and repeat, basically. That's all there really is to a console application as far as getting started. So in methods, we use Pascal case as opposed to camel case in JavaScript as the convention for naming your methods. So you're going to capitalize each word and the first word also. There are conventions that we use, and that's what we do in C#. A requirement is on your parameters to include the types. So we talked about type inference, where when you're creating a variable, you can use var. But in the parameter list for your method, you do have to specify what the types are. You also have to, that's for the input parameters, same thing for the return type. You have to specify what type of variable, what type of object you're going to be returning from your method. If you're not planning to return anything, use the word void. And that means that the method will do some action, but it won't return any data back. So the signature of the method is just this part. I'm not including the body or what the method does. This is just the return type, either void or string for these two examples, the name of the method, writeLine or readLine, and then the input parameters. And you see here that value is a string. As opposed to JavaScript where you wouldn't include that part. In C# you do have to specify what the types are. One thing you can do in C# that you can't do in JavaScript is overload a method. I can have several different versions of a method with the same name as long as the signatures are different. So one example is substring. I can have a version of the method that only takes in the start index. I can also have a method called substring with the same name that takes in 2 parameters instead of just 1. That's how the compiler knows which version of the method you want to use based on what you're passing in as input parameters. So in this case, substring has 2 options, and that's something you can't do in JavaScript. So a big part of C# programming is object-oriented programming, and you might be somewhat used to that from classes in JavaScript, but I think it's a little bit different in C#. But just in case you're not sure what a class is, you can think of it as a template or a blueprint for creating objects, and we call the object an instance of that class. So the class is the general entity, and the object is a specific instance of that type of thing. And we call a method called a constructor to create an instance of the class called an object. So I shared these instructions with y'all. Were you able to go through any of these, installing Visual Studio Code on your computer, installing the .NET Core SDK, and there's a C# extension for Visual Studio Code. If you've done those things, you'll be able to follow along with my demo. If not, you might really quick, instructions are in Slack and in the Meetup group. You might be able to catch up with us by going there and looking at those instructions. So also my demo code is on GitHub. I put it in the C# intro repo. I also put the program code in a gist. So either way, you can go to my GitHub page and hopefully find the code that we're going through. I'll get back to this at the end, but if I have interested you in C# and you want to continue learning, here are some ways that you can do that. The first one is the OKC Meetup. It meets here on the first Monday of every month at lunchtime, except in July it'll be delayed a week due to Independence Day. But you can find the previous talks on Twitch and on YouTube. This last one was on F#, and it was really good. I really recommend, if you're interested in .NET programming or functional programming, to check out that talk by Aaron. He did a great job. I know it's a free code camp meetup, but I wanted to plug for Code School and Pluralsight. Those are both paid sites, so they're not free, but Code School does have a few mini courses to try out different languages, and they just came out with one on C#. So you do have to create an account with Code School to be able to access this, but you watch a little video and then do a few browser exercises, similar to Free Code Camp, but I think a little bit more interactive maybe is the right word. So I would recommend creating a Code School account and trying out this course, and maybe you'll find a few other free courses that you're interested in, or you might even want to get a paid account. Pluralsight is owned by the same company, or Pluralsight owns Code School. And again, it's paid, but if you go to visualstudio.com/devessentials and get an account with them, you'll get 3 months of free access to Pluralsight. And there, it's mostly videos that you'll be watching, but they're on all sorts of different topics, and they can be much more advanced. So if you want to continue your learning path, I think this is a good way to go. Code School and then Pluralsight. So we're going to switch to Visual Studio Code. If you don't have this installed on your computer, I would definitely recommend it. It should work with Mac or PC or Linux. If you have questions with Mac, you can talk to Carson or Daniel, and they will definitely be able to help you. I will not. But hopefully you've got that installed, and we're able to install the .NET Core SDK and the C# extension. Those are the 3 steps that you need to do to be able to run C# code. And I'm actually new to Visual Studio Code. I'm used to Visual Studio, but I didn't want to go through all the steps of setting that up. So we're going to use Visual Studio Code, which I'm not an expert at. Again, we had a great lightning talk at the OKC group that you can find, if not on YouTube, definitely on Twitch, that goes through a little bit of Visual Studio Code. So here is my Hello World application. I followed the instructions that I posted in the Free Code Camp Slack channel. So you should be able to do this. It was just a few steps, not too hard, to create the program itself. And then I went through and added some code to demo some of the features that I talked about earlier. So I've got most of it commented out. I'm just wanting to run this display title method. So I hover over it, I see that it does not have a return type. The return type is void. I can click F12 to see the contents of the method. And here I was talking about type inference, where I can just use var. It's not exactly the same as var in JavaScript, but it is similar. When I'm creating a variable, it knows that this title is a string. So I could type the word string here or var. Either way, it does the exact same thing. And I'm going to pass that title variable into the console.writeLine method, and it expects a string. So I can hover over and get a lot of really good information about what this method does, what it's expecting as parameters, what it's going to give as a return type. And what I want to talk about here is that the type is static. So even though I use var, it's not like in JavaScript, I can't do title equals 1, 2, 3. That'll give me a compile time error, which is a huge difference between C# and JavaScript, is that right now I know that I've done something wrong. It's not waiting until runtime to find out that title should not be a number, title should be a string. So if I run this, and to do that I type .NET space run, hit enter. I actually did an arrow key up to get the previous thing that I typed, just to save. And so if you're used to JavaScript, that little delay there between when I hit enter and when it actually ran the code might be a little bit annoying to you. That's just part of C# being a compiled language. So you're going to have to get used to the idea of the compiler doing something in the background. So the next method I want to look at is one that does return a value that's not void. And my example is getFirstName. So here I can see that getFirstName returns a string, and I am storing that in a firstName variable. I'm using var here because it knows that this is a string. We can go look at what this method does. And like I said before, in a console app, you're generally writing some instructions to the user and then reading in their answer to a question or their input they want to put into the program. So I write line, what is your first name? And I read line, the first name, and I return that. And I want to show here again that I can't return a value like 1, 2, 3. I'm going to get an error immediately because I told it that this method returns a string. I don't have any other choice but returning a string. The next method I am going to run is called greetUser. It takes in a string and it's void, does not return anything. So the value I'm going to send in is my first name variable that we just got. Let's go look and see what this does. If you're familiar with string interpolation in JavaScript, C# just added that same feature, and I'm a big fan of it. I use it all the time, possibly too much. But I'm a big fan of string interpolation. So I'm just going to write back to the user, hi. So let's see why I'm getting error. What did I just do? Oh, I actually deleted my G. That's not good. So I'm going to run this. It's going to ask me for my name and say hi to me. So this is your very typical Hello World. If you've never done a Hello World app, you will. In practically every language you learn, you're going to go through these same types of steps. So we can go into something a little bit more advanced. Past strings, I want to get into integers. So I want the current user's first name, and I also want their age. And so here we get a little bit more advanced because I'm pulling in a string through console.readline. If I look at its signature, I see that it returns a string. So when I assign that value to a variable, that's going to be a string. It's not an integer like I want. Because the return type of my method is an int, so I need this value to be an integer. One option you have is to use int.parse. It takes in a string and returns an integer, and you'd think that's exactly what we need and want. Let's do that. But I'm not going to, because the user could type in something that's not a string, and that would give me an error at runtime. They would give the user an error, and we want to avoid that as much as we possibly can. So if you ever see input string with not in the correct format, if you're not used to that, that's an error message that you'll see all the time, and that's the type of thing that's happening, is it's expecting some data type and not getting it. So what I'm going to do instead of int.parse is int.tryparse. We do a lot of trying in C#, because I want to see whether this can be parsed to an integer before I actually do it, because I don't want that code to break. So I can read a lot about how this works, but the signature at the bottom says that it takes in a string, and there's an out parameter, which I don't want to get into too much, but that's where the result is going to go. And the method returns a Boolean, true if it worked and false if it didn't. So I have my age variable here, it's an integer, and that's what's going to be passed out of as an out parameter from my method. If this is successful, if this is true, I'm going to write that age to the console and return it from my method. Else, I'm going to tell the user they made a mistake and return null. Null, I think, is a little bit different in C# versus JavaScript, but I'm denoting that null is a possible value by this question mark here. So just int means that it can be 0 and positive and negative numbers, but it can't be null. The question mark indicates that null is allowed. So I think we will go ahead and run this, and it'll ask me for my age, my name and my age. It'll display title, get first name, greet user, and get age. So we see that that did work. It was able to parse my answer because we ran this line of code. So this try-parse did return a true value. If we want to see what happens if I make a mistake and don't type an integer, I get this line happening. And it's returning null back to the calling method, which is main in this case. So the next thing I want to talk about is creating an object based on this data that we've gotten from the user. Let's go look at the person class and see what it has in it. And again, F12, you're going to be using all the time. Click F12 to go to the definition of the person class. I see that I have a first name field that defaults to private. That is a difference between C# and JavaScript. JavaScript defaults to public, and if you want to make something private, you have to do something extra. C# is the opposite. If you want to make something public, you have to say so. It defaults to private. So I have I don't want to get too much into properties, but this is an example of a property for a field. And here's another one, my age property and my age field. So here are two constructors. Again, this is something you can do in C# that you can't do in JavaScript, which is have a method name that's repeated as long as the signature is different. So maybe I want age to be an optional parameter. Actually, optional parameter is something different, but I want it to be optional to pass in an age. So these are two different ways of calling the person constructor. And the last thing I have in my person class is a method called displayInfo that returns void. It doesn't take anything in because it's part of this, and there you go with that this word that can be very confusing. It's taking the person's age, seeing whether it has a value. If so, we will print it to the console. If age does not have a value, we'll say that this person's age is unknown. So let's, yes. Yeah, let's do that. So here I'm calling the person. That's a great question. The question was, what does it look like to call the constructor the two different ways? So I have on this line, I'm creating a current user object of the person class, and I'm passing in first name and age. So what I could do instead is have some other user where I'm just passing in a first name. So it knows which code to run based on the arguments that you're passing in. That was a great question. So what I'm going to do here is take the current user's first name and age and display that information about them. So I'm going to .NET Run. It's going to ask me my questions again. And so I have information about my person. The name is and the age. If I did that exact same code with an invalid age, then it just says that the age is unknown. Are there any questions so far about that? Did that make sense? How to call the constructor for the class? Another thing I want to talk about, which I didn't go over in my slides, but I think is a really cool thing about C#, is lists. In JavaScript, there are arrays, and C# has arrays also. But when I'm coding, I almost always use a list instead of an array. I think it's just easier to work with. So when I create a skills object here, I am assigning it the type of list of string, is how you pronounce that, when you have those angle brackets of list of string. And I'm instantiating it. I'm creating a new object, a new list of strings. In that case, it's just going to be, at this point, it's going to be an empty list of strings. So I'm going to ask the user to enter their skills one at a time, one per line, and then I give, write line is used a lot for instructions. So I'm telling the user, enter your skills, enter a blank line to indicate that's all your skills. So what I'm going to do next is read line. And again, this is a construct you'll see all the time. Write something to the user with instructions, and then read their input back. So here I am reading in their skill, and again, I could have used var here. That's totally fine because read line returns a string. So it knows that skill is a string. So I can call a string method on that skill. I'm passing in skill into the is null or white space method. I use this method all the time to see whether a user actually gave me any real data, as opposed to just typing space or tab or something. So this is the not that you're probably used to. So I'm saying while it's not null or white space, let's add their skill that they entered to the list of skills, and then go get the next skill. And so we'll just repeat that as many times as the user wants to enter something. And then when they've entered a blank line, we're going to write a summary back to the user saying the count of skills they entered. And again, this is string interpolation. Another thing that you might be used to in JavaScript is the ternary operator. This is the ternary operator in C#. I'm asking a question. Is the count of skills equal to 1? If so, we're just going to use empty string here. Otherwise, add an S, because I want to pluralize the word skill to make it skill for just one, skills for 0 or more than 1. So at this point, we can run the code. I probably could have taken out the previous lines that we don't really need anymore, but it's going to ask me my name, my age, my skills. Right now, C# is my only skill. So I have one skill. But now maybe I have more skills. No, maybe I don't have any skills at all. So I have 0 skills. This is string interpolation and the ternary operator, and I use those quite a bit. I really like those. C#, I'm also skilled at SQL. So I have 2 skills. So that is an example of a list. This is how you create your list and new it up, as we say, create a new instance, and then just add items to that list here. Another thing I wanted to show is enumerations. This is something that JavaScript doesn't have, and I wish it did, because I use these all the time in C#. You can create constants. This is essentially a constant called organizer, and the value is 1. And this is a constant called member, and the organizer, or the value is 2. And I can group these together in a named enum called roles. And so now if I want to use this ID value of 1 or 2, I'm not going to hard code those numbers in my code. You want to avoid that as much as you can. Magic numbers are not good. You want to have a word that describes why is it 1, why is it 2. And in this case, you couldn't use 3. 3 would not be an option. You're going to use roles.organizer, roles.member, but roles.something else is not an option here. So again, C# might feel a little bit more constraining to you. Your options are a little bit limited, but that's intentional so that you can make assumptions about the code and not have to always be checking things. So I feel like in JavaScript you do a lot of type checking in your code, a lot of checking for things that you don't have to do in C# because it knows that your options have been limited. Another example in enum, I have created a colors enum with just 3 different options, red, green, and blue. So purple would not be an option. There is no definition for purple. But this is an example of where I think using colors.red would be much clearer than having this value hard-coded. So that is the demo code that I put up on GitHub. If you have any questions about it, let me know. You can ask in Slack. I want to go back to the link to show you the getting started that we just went through. So if you don't have that either from the Slack or from the meetup, I would definitely recommend going to this link and following the instructions. We install Visual Studio Code. Even if you're not going to be doing C#, Visual Studio Code is a really good code editor to use. I like it a lot. You can, again, do it on Mac. If you have a Mac, ask Carson or Daniel or someone other than me. We're using .NET Core, which, again, is a little bit new to me. I'm used to the .NET framework and using Visual Studio proper as opposed to Visual Studio Code. So this was good for me to learn those things, too. And then if you want to write some C#, you install an extension to Visual Studio Code. So we went through this demo. Again, it's on my GitHub if you want to check that out. And then I wanted to go back to these continue learning. Go to the OKC group if you can, or catch their talks on Twitch or on YouTube. Code School also does have a paid course for C#, but again, as opposed to Free Code Camp, there is a cost to Code School and then also Pluralsight after your trial ends. You have to decide whether it's worth paying, but I think both of those sites are really good. So I would recommend, if you're interested at all in learning this new language, again, even if you don't plan to ever use it, I think it's good if we just think about what's good about learning Spanish. We can talk to people in Spanish. We can talk to people about Spanish. We can speak knowledgeably about this other language where you couldn't before. You can make comparisons to your first language, JavaScript or English or whatever the case may be. You can maybe take things for granted a little bit less about your language. You don't even know, if you only know one language, what other options are out there. Like, is this feature of my language something that's in all languages, or is this just specific to my language? Or how is it implemented differently in another language? So I would definitely recommend, if it's not C#, find some other language that sounds interesting to you. Just knowing more than one language will help with your job marketability, but also I think it'll make you a better JavaScript developer to know these other languages. Do you all have any questions for me? What's your question?
Can you go back and touch on enums again?
Yes, I love to talk about enums. I didn't want to get too much into them. And if you get me started, I might not stop because I really like them a lot. I've been told that that can be a code smell if you use them too much, but so I probably do, and that probably is not good. I don't know whether they're liars or not, but enums are really cool. Did you have a specific question about them?
I noticed that you use world organizers. Is that a traditional, real-world example?
This is a real-world example that I thought of when I was thinking about our meetup today. Like, what's a list of IDs that I might have in a database, and I don't want to refer to ID 1 in my code. I want to distinguish, what's the difference between 1 and 2? Why am I using these numbers? As much as possible, don't use hard-coded numbers in your code. Use constants or use enums if you're in C# to use a word. So the person coming behind you and reading your code has some idea of why you use the value 36. Like, where did that come from? Is that a hard, why 36? Is this 36 over here the same as that 36 over there, or are they different? I don't know. So as much as possible, use constant names. I didn't show a way to use this. I could if you're interested in seeing how an enum is actually used. I'll comment out this other code that we're not using anymore. Organizers? No, roles. And so you'll see here that I didn't have a choice to type anything else here. I'm getting an error if I type something other than organizer or member. So this might not do what you're expecting it to do right now. You might be thinking, well, I don't know what you're thinking, but we'll see what it does. And again, this time that it takes, this is the string organizer. So this is actually really useful that I have access to the word organizer in my code. And also if I wanted to use the integer value, I need to cast that to an int. I didn't get into casting, but this is how you cast a value. And so if I wanted the number that goes along with organizer, that's the way I would get it. It's going to be really useful to have access to your constant both as a name and as a value. Anything else about enumerations that you want to know? I really like them. I think that that's something that I kind of miss in JavaScript, coming from C#. So might just take down my code, pull down my code, and play around with it. See what types of enumerations you can create and what happens when you try to use them. But the main idea is that if I have some value that the user passed in, like maybe I give them an option. So the user entered 1. And then I can compare the user's input, like check whether they entered this certain value. So that can be really useful. I use that all the time. Any other questions? You can ask more questions if you want to. Yes, lists are great. I don't know that I can go over them just off the top of my head. But yes, I use lists all the time. You can do lots of things with them that I'm not really prepared to go through. But if you want to see the IntelliSense, which I think is a huge reason to use an IDE, there are all sorts of things here that maybe I didn't even know existed if I'm just looking at them. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So I used add. There are lots more things that I can do with a list. I use lists all the time. I think they're much easier to use, maybe more intuitive than an array. But JavaScript uses arrays, so at this point you might be more comfortable with arrays. I really like lists. What's your question?
Could you have a list of mixed types?
Kind of. In generics you could, I think, but no. When I created this list of skills, I can't add 1, 2, 3. That's not going to. So that's the difference between JavaScript's arrays.
You would have to close that quote, say add 1, 2, 3.
Exactly. So if I am very skilled at 1, 2, 3, that's how I would need to do that. I can't add an integer.
If you wanted to like emulate the behavior of a list of mixed types, like in another language, how would you do it in C#?
This is a great question that's kind of out of the scope of what I've got prepared. But the question was, if you wanted basically to have objects of different types, could you and how would you do that? And I can get back to you on that later. Kind of. We could talk about it later. Good question. Kind of outside of I wanted to really keep this to the basics of C#. I think at this point you know enough that if you wanted to learn more, you could, and you kind of see maybe the reasons for learning C#. It sounds like you might be interested in learning more, and I definitely recommend that. But you're getting a little bit past the very basics, which is what I wanted to go over today. But great questions. Any other questions? If not, I think we're done.